Leahy Foundation and the Institute for Sustainable Solutions. I'm Bob Costanza. I'm the director of the Institute for Sustainable Solutions. And tonight we're pleased to have Gail Achterman. She's the director of the Institute for Natural Resources. And Gail she also serves as the chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission and on the advisory board of the Klamath Basin Rangeland Trust. And before joining the Institute for Natural Resources, she served as executive director of the Deschutes Resources Conservancy. She got her master's degree in natural resources policy from the University of Michigan, and she got a JD from the University of Michigan as well. So she's been a practicing lawyer for 18 years. And she was also served as Governor Neil Goldschmidt's assistant for natural resources. And today she's going to tell us a very interesting story, I think with some very nice solutions at the end about water reallocation for people and the environment in the Deschutes. So let's welcome Gail.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of the first Solutions Seminar series. And it's a pleasure to talk about the Deschutes as a great example of the kind of solutions that the Institute for Sustainable Solutions is all about. Many of you, I'm sure, in this audience are familiar with the Deschutes Basin in Central Oregon, but to really tell this story, we need to learn a little bit more about the basin. People really aren't as aware as they should be of how large the Deschutes Basin is. It's the second largest watershed in Oregon. It's it's almost 11,000 square miles. It's almost a twin of the Willamette Basin. They're really quite similar in size. But the population in the Deschutes Basin at the 2000 census was about 227,000 people compared to about 2,300,000 people in the Willamette Basin. But as many of you are very acutely aware, between 2000 and 2010, the population of the Deschutes Basin, particularly in the area between Bend, Redmond, Prineville, and then up to Sisters, grew extremely rapidly. It was one of the most rapidly growing areas in the United States, with almost 100%, almost a doubling of population this is a 2000 census number, and it's almost doubled. So that poses real challenges in a semi-arid environment. The Deschutes Basin is certainly not a desert, but it has parts of it that are a lot like a desert, and it's a lot drier than it is here. The problem then with this rapid increase in population is how do you meet the needs of that population? And as we'll see a little bit later in this story, how do you meet the needs of the environment with this population increase? And so to sort of set the stage for what the problems were with water in the Deschutes and then what the solutions were, we also need to understand that the Deschutes is a very unusual basin in that the hydrology is driven by groundwater. So you might sometime next time you're up on Mount Bachelor, look and notice that there are no road ditches on any of the roads on Mount Bachelor, and there aren't road ditches on most of the roads in the Deschutes National Forest. Why? Because the ground is so permeable with the young volcanics that there isn't runoff. It goes almost directly in to this enormous groundwater aquifer that recharges at nearly 38 cubic feet per second annually. So the river flow at its mouth, where it enters the Columbia, is about 2,000 CFS. It's recharging at 3,800 CFS just through the groundwater system. And it's going through very permeable rocks, and it's this massive, massive aquifer. So how's the water allocated in the Deschutes Basin? this is a graph that could be a graph of almost any basin in the western United States. So the rights to use the water under Western water law provide this is a little higher in the Deschutes because the population's low. If you saw these figures in the Willamette, the agricultural use would be closer to 60 or 70%. But in the Deschutes, about 90% of the water rights are allocated to agriculture. There's 1% for resorts, about 4% in-stream, and about 5% municipal and industrial. So the vast amount of the existing water rights are all allocated for agricultural use. But you have this dramatic change in the nature of the communities with the population increase as the Central Oregon area shifted from being an agricultural and forest industry area with the communities dependent upon ag and forestry to communities that are dependent upon tourism, recreation, and are increasingly attracting new industries in high-tech, renewable energy because of the attractiveness of the natural environment. What happened when the area was settled, and Central Oregon was actually settled quite late in terms of the history of Oregon, the history of the western United States. It really didn't begin to be settled until the railroads and the irrigation infrastructure started to be developed in like the 1880s, 1890s. It was here in the Willamette Valley. Settlement really actively started about 1840. This was at least 50 years later. But what happened when the development started, and particularly when the water development started, was the entire system was replumbed. Now, the Willamette was replumbed for flood control starting in the 1950s with the 13 Corps of Engineers projects. The Deschutes was replumbed for irrigated agriculture. And this hydrograph of the water development shows all of the reservoirs, with the principal reservoirs being up in the Prineville area, the Ochoco Reservoir, it's Ochoco and Prineville reservoirs that store water in the Crooked River sub-basin of the Deschutes for irrigated agriculture with the Ochoco Irrigation District, to the Wickiup Reservoir, which stores water for the main irrigation districts in the Bend area, Central Oregon Irrigation District, North Unit Irrigation District, Arnold Irrigation District, and Crescent Lake, which also supplies water to those Bend area irrigation districts. And I'm not even remembering what reservoir that is, although some of you here, I think that's Paulina Lake, and it's not actually an artificial storage reservoir. But you can see how the entire system was replumbed for large storage reservoirs to control the flows, to deliver water to agriculture. And you can see the extent of the agricultural development. So you see the major cities are highlighted with the red circles, and then if you look at the colored areas here, you can see the extent of irrigated agriculture. And this is, I'll give you the exact number it's up there, 160,000 acres of land that are irrigated artificially through diversions from the Deschutes River system. And these irrigation districts have appropriated, as you saw on the earlier graph, about 90% of the water. The most senior water rights are the Swally Irrigation District, which was a privately developed district originally, and the next most senior rights are the Arnold District, which was also privately developed before the big federal reclamation projects came in. Then you have the Central Oregon Irrigation District, which is all of this purple. So it's all through this is the city of Bend. So you can see in the city of Bend, you've got service from Arnold, Central Oregon Irrigation District, and Swally. Tumalo Irrigation District, which was, again, initially private and then became a reclamation district. Three Sisters Irrigation District, which is in the Wycus Creek area around Sisters. And then the irrigation districts over here, Ochoco Irrigation District is Crooked River water. And it was originally privately developed with the Ochoco Reservoir and then became a reclamation project with the development of the Prineville Reservoir. And then the very junior water rights are the North Unit Irrigation District. And if you have driven to Central Oregon and you drive down through the canyon at Warm Springs and you cross the Deschutes and then you come up on the other side and you go through all those irrigated fields on the big plateau heading into Madras, that Agency Plains area, that's the North Unit Irrigation District. Now, one of the other important things to remember when you look at this map is Bend is at 3,500 feet, more or less. Madras is at about 2,200 feet. The really high value agriculture, some of the highest value agriculture in the state of Oregon is in the North Unit. And they have the very junior water rights. The lowest priority, they have the least reliable water supply for the most valuable agricultural production. The senior water rights in Swally are almost entirely irrigating residential properties or semi-residential properties. In all of these irrigation districts in the Bend area, including Three Sisters Irrigation District, not including the irrigation districts from the Crooked River, there is only one commercial farm operation that would really be considered a commercial farm operation. Almost all the rest, most of the irrigation in the Bend area is pasture. And it does provide feed for llamas and horses, and some of the horse operations are very, very high value, but it is not high value-added agriculture of the kind in the North Unit where they're growing very high-value seed crops, garlic seed, echinacea seed, essential oil seeds. And so that gives you a little bit of a portrait of what this water for agriculture is actually used for and the extent, and particularly notice the overlap of the irrigation districts with the cities. So you've got a lot of irrigation water rights that are actually inside the urban growth boundaries for the cities. So if you look again, this is just another slide underscoring, if you look at the irrigation diversions from the river compared to the municipal diversions from the river, they are radically different, and the irrigation diversions have been reducing generally between 1966 and 2001, while the municipal diversions have been increasing slightly. So what happens as a result of these irrigation and municipal diversion? What happens to the river? Well, this diagram, which is fondly in the basin referred to as the whale diagram, was developed by a marvelous man who is a longtime water master for the Deschutes Basin. And the hydrograph shows you for natural flow, summer and winter flow, what the flow of the Deschutes River is. And everyone calls it the whale. That's why it kind of has a face on the upper one, because it was this whale diagram, and this is an important lesson in terms of solutions. It was this diagram that visually showed people in the Deschutes Basin once it was developed in about 2000 and started being handed out everywhere, printed as an insert in the Bend Bulletin. People suddenly realized that while there was 2,000 CFS discharging at the mouth of the river down where you drive over across the Deschutes on I-84, that in the summer, the river is completely dewatered in its entire middle reach. And not only is the main Deschutes dewatered in the middle reach, Tumalo Creek and Wycus Creek are also dewatered historically. So from 1910 approximately, or certainly from 1950 when the North Unit District came on, until 2000, you had major sections of the upper part of the Deschutes River completely dewatered by irrigation diversions and municipal diversions. Well, at about that time in 2000, a conversation started happening. And the conversation began, and again, this is part of Solutions. The conversation began because the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Indian Reservation and Portland General Electric were both applying to renew the hydroelectric license on the dams at Pelton and Round Butte. And with that relicensing procedure, these people started getting together on a pretty regular basis. And all these people are great friends of mine. And Jim Noteboom, who was a lawyer at Carnot Peterson in Bend and the legal counsel for the Confederated Tribes, who passed away before he was able to see the results of his brilliant work, was really a critical person in these conversations. And he had actually invited the Environmental Defense Fund and Zach Willey, who was a senior economist for EDF, who was living in Bend at the time, to help start advising the tribe about how they could build a sustainable economy on the Warm Springs Reservation. The irrigation districts, and Ron Nelson there on the left of the picture was the manager of Central Oregon Irrigation District. They were participating in the relicensing procedure because they wanted to make sure their water rights were protected. They didn't want the relicensing to affect anything related to the water rights in the basin. And through getting together on hydro relicensing and starting conversations among this national environmental group, the tribes, and the irrigation district, they started to talk about what are the challenges for the Deschutes. What do we care about regarding the Deschutes? How do we want to see the Deschutes in our futures from our various perspectives? And through that conversation, they ended up forming what was then called the Deschutes Resources Conservancy in 1996. I became the first full-time executive director in 2000. And they formed it through a federal authorization that just authorized the Bureau of Reclamation to fund, to provide grants to a 501c3 organization, the Deschutes Resources Conservancy, to try to restore the Deschutes. And it was very general. And in fact, the legislation, the federal legislation, contained exactly the same language for the Klamath Basin as was contained for the Deschutes Basin. And we know what happened in 2002 in the Klamath. All hell broke loose, and relations among everyone in the basin were ruptured for nearly a decade. But starting in 1996 with exactly the same authorization and significantly less money, a fraction of the money that went into the process in the Klamath, these people from all walks of life in the Deschutes Basin came together on the board with a fairly minimal amount of money. The most they ever got in federal appropriations in any given year was $1 million. And they came from the forest industry, they came from the real estate development industry, they came from city governments, they were small business people, they were members of the Confederated Tribes, that was the longtime water master, the Forest Service, they all came together and started talking together about what would we do if we were going to solve this problem of the dewatering of the Deschutes. And the one thing that brought them all together with all their competing interests was that they really thought, mainly because of the intellectual capital that Zach Willey brought to the conversation, that if they could use voluntary market-based tools, they could restore the flows in the river. And they believed that. Now, no one had ever done it. No one in the country had ever tried to use voluntary market-based tools to restore stream flows in a river basin. And so what approach did they use? What did they do? Well, let me back up for a second. The key thing that they did was the board of directors, and in part, I mean, I learned so much from these people personally. I had a lot of years being a water lawyer. I'd done a lot of Endangered Species Act work. I had a pretty comprehensive knowledge and understanding of what it takes to move water from out-of-stream uses to in-stream uses. I'd personally done a lot of work representing a lot of these irrigation districts on various water law issues. I'd represented some of the timber industry people on forest practices regulations. But I'm a policy wonk type of person. And what these business people on this board and the tribal leaders who have a real long-term view did was they said, look, we don't have a lot of money, and what we need to do is we need to experiment. We need to try some things out because we don't really know what is going to work. And so we just need to try some things. And we shouldn't spend a lot of time sitting around and doing a plan for restoration of stream flows. You know, let's not do any planning. We're a 501c3. We just want to put water back in the river. And everybody around here, we can all agree we want to put water back in the river. And I should add, one of the reasons they wanted to put water back in the river was because one of the big things they decided in relicensing Pelton Round Butte is they were going to restore fish passage, and they were going to reintroduce salmon and steelhead in the upper basin. And if there wasn't any water, then there weren't going to be any salmon or steelhead. So they started experimenting. And they started experimenting by leasing water in stream and by doing some piping projects. And I'm going to get back to this a little bit more because those are part of the solution. But the big part of the solution, in my opinion, had nothing to do with policy reform. It had nothing to do with, it had to do with really understanding this system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But the critical ingredient was the wisdom of the tribal leaders and the wisdom of the business leaders who said, we need to try some things out to see whether you can put water back in the river and keep everybody else whole. And so this was a critical step in about 2000, 2003 period when the DRC really started the experiments. And so with that, at the same time, because of the rapid population growth, simultaneously with the DRC voluntary coming together, starting the conversation, there were some beginnings of major regulatory constraints. There was the realization that you couldn't continue to divert water from the river, and you couldn't continue to appropriate groundwater and survive and thrive. It was simply not going to be sustainable because the groundwater, the solution to the population increase in the Deschutes had always been that you couldn't divert the surface water because it had all been appropriated for irrigation, and the river had been withdrawn, so you couldn't file any more water right applications to divert water from the river. So the only source of water was that huge groundwater aquifer. But what happened was that the Water Resources Department and the U.S. Geological Survey did a study that showed that the groundwater aquifer, again, young volcanics, was completely connected to the surface water system, and they had to be managed as one system. And as soon as that realization occurred, the Water Resources Department put a moratorium on any new groundwater diversions, any new wells in the basin. And so it was a real threat to that booming real estate market in the Deschutes in the 2000 until the recent crash period. And people were extremely anxious about this. And what ultimately happened in about 2002 is that which really helped accelerate the development of the reallocation of water from out-of-stream uses to in-stream uses was the adoption of the groundwater mitigation requirement by rule, where the Water Resources Department said, if you're going to divert water from groundwater, you have to replace it bucket for bucket by restoring in-stream flows. So for every bit of groundwater you pump, you have to replace it with water in stream. So suddenly there was a regulatory imperative that anybody who was doing municipal or resort or any other kind of development was going to have to start offsetting the development of the groundwater with restoration of in-stream flows. And this map just shows the groundwater recharge zones. So if you're developing a house in the Sisters area, you have to do your mitigation in Wycus Creek. If you're developing in the Crooked River, you have to do your mitigation in the Crooked River. If you're developing in the Upper Deschutes, and so on. So there are these areas of influence, so you're actually restoring in the right surface water source. So while the DRC had started on the notion of we can do this using voluntary mechanisms to put water back in stream, a regulatory imperative through groundwater mitigation requirements accelerated the conversation and got a lot of folks' attention. The other thing that happened was the federal Columbia River hydro system, which the Deschutes is sort of involved in. It's technically a part of the federal Columbia River hydro system with the private generation at Pelton Round Butte. But the Deschutes and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs have always been eligible for Fish and Wildlife mitigation funding under the Northwest Power and Conservation Act, Northwest Power Planning and Conservation Act. And even though all of the biological opinions and all of the assessments of the need for restoration of fish and wildlife habitat in the Columbia Basin called for restoration of in-stream flows as a limiting factor for the fish, Bonneville Power and the Power Planning Council had been singularly ineffective from the early 80s until the early 2000s in actually getting water back in stream. They had virtually done nothing. And the Oregon Water Trust and other organizations that were actively working to put water back in stream had a very, very difficult time working with Bonneville to get the fish and wildlife mitigation money into in-stream flow restoration. So the other development that really helped from a governmental standpoint to complement the efforts of the DRC collaboratively in the basin is that the Columbia Basin Water Transactions Program was established by Bonneville, where instead of using their traditional way of allocating their mitigation funds, they donated their funding, granting a multi-million-dollar funding stream to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to just do water transactions for stream flow restoration in the basin. So while the DRC historically had been dependent upon at most $1 million a year from the Bureau of Reclamation budget to do in-stream flow restoration, suddenly with the groundwater mitigation rules, there were buyers of in-stream water rights who wanted to acquire in-stream water rights to offset their groundwater development, but there was also significant new capital available to acquire water rights to dedicate for in-stream flows through the Bonneville Fish and Wildlife Mitigation funding. And as a result, with this groundwork laid on the voluntary basis through the DRC, with the rapid urbanization, with the subbasin plan, a variety of these governmental actions, what finally happened in 2004 is that the Deschutes Water Alliance came together. And the Deschutes Water Alliance is the institutional mechanism that is leading to the solution of how do you provide water for in-stream flow restoration simultaneously with water for a very rapidly growing population without destroying the important agricultural economic base in Central Oregon that is very much a part of the community that no one wanted to lose. And the Deschutes Water Alliance really came together with the irrigation districts, who by this time had all come together and formed kind of a united board of control. That's the joint venture of all 7 of the irrigation districts, the Confederated Tribes, the DRC, all of the Central Oregon cities, and all 3 of the major counties in Central Oregon. And they came together and said, we think we can solve the reallocation problem. And they agreed on what their mission was: improving stream flows and water quality for multiple purpose benefit, getting an affordable supply of water to sustain agriculture, but also an affordable supply for urban communities. So it's the environment, it's agriculture, it's cities. And they are committed to doing all of this together. They invested in additional analytical work to really refine the problem and refine their own understanding of the problem. And they looked out to 2025 and they said, if we're going to reallocate water, what's the new demand going to be? You know, we know what it was in the past. What's it going to be in 2025? And they said agriculture is going to be about 13%. Because of the changes that are going on in agriculture and because of the approved urban growth boundaries where the cities were moving out into a lot of the irrigated lands based on approved land use plans. Resorts, they're going to be about 9%, municipal about 2%, and in-stream needed to be 76%. Well, this graph looks a lot different than that earlier graph with 90% agriculture and 1% in-stream, or whatever the small in-stream number was beforehand. So then they reframed the question. They said, okay, how are we going to get 260,000 acre-feet of water to do this redistribution? If that's how much we have to reallocate to be the kind of place we want to be, how are we going to get the water to do that? And as they looked at, and they did a whole series of pretty in-depth studies on this, the DRC was very involved in doing a lot of the studies, but so were private consulting firms, so was the staff of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and they analyzed all the various options for how they could reallocate 260,000 acre-feet of water and sustain agriculture, cities, and restore the stream flows in the river. And they concluded that if they could do it by conserving water, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, they could get 49% of the way there by conserving water. They could do 8% of it by annual in-stream leasing, by leasing water in-stream voluntarily. They could do 24% through permanent transfers of water from irrigation or other uses to in-stream uses. And they could get the other 19% by improved management of all those reservoirs we talked about earlier and using them to optimize the stream flows when they're needed at particular times during the year. So let's talk. So what they were able to do then, and think about solutions, which is the theme of our seminar series here, careful analysis of the problem, building the coalitions, having the funding streams and policy directions through the groundwater mitigation rules, plus the redeployment, redevelopment of the Bonneville Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Program. And once you then really honed in on what the problem was, identifying the range of solutions and then implementing them. Now, think back to the DRC with the people willing to get their feet wet. They experimented, and one of the reasons that the solutions were able to be developed was because before the problem got to be really acute, some experiments were going on, and you could actually see what kind of results you could get through, I'm going to back up one slide here, through these various approaches. And if you hadn't done the experimentation with these different methods, it would have been hard to get the more refined solution because you wouldn't have had any data upon which to develop the solution, let alone public buy-in that it would actually work. So the first approach, and this was one of the first things that the DRC had done in its experimentation, is canal piping. Remember that picture of all the irrigation districts and the irrigation district boundaries? Those farmers in the North Unit Irrigation District, who are some of the most successful, profitable, high-value farmers in the state, they grow their crops on about 2 acre-feet per acre per year of water. 2 acre-feet per acre. And an acre-foot is enough water to cover an acre of land 12 inches deep. So 2 acre-feet, 48 inches of, actually not 48 inches, 24 inches of water over the course of the year. The Arnold Irrigation District, or let's take, well, Arnold isn't up there, but all the rest of these older districts, these are all more senior districts, have water allocations per acre that are, Swaley's is 8 acre-feet per acre per year. Arnold Irrigation District is 15 acre-feet per acre per year. They are not growing rice in Swaley or Arnold Irrigation District, but they have to divert 15 acre-feet of water to get 2 to 3 acre-feet to the field because all of these ditches historically were unlined, and it's in very porous volcanic soils. So you had so much loss through seepage in the canals that you were diverting way more water than you needed to actually get to the field. So one of the solutions was that if you could pipe the canal, then you didn't lose all of that water. You could deliver the 2 acre-feet per acre instead of the 8, and you had 6 that you could reallocate. But piping is very expensive, and until this coalition came together, there'd been no funding available, and the irrigation districts and their customers couldn't afford to do the piping. But by the irrigation districts putting up some money, the irrigation districts put up a lot of in-kind labor. They donated a lot of equipment. The board members of the Three Sisters Irrigation District learned how to lay the pipe. They were out there driving the equipment, laying the pipe. So they did a lot of in-kind labor, and they did the project management, and then the conservation funders would put in the money to, buy the piping material. And as a result, you can have tremendous benefits in terms of stream flow restoration. If you're ever driving through Sisters, get out one day and stop on the bridge on Wycus Creek. Wycus Creek used to be 70% of the steelhead production for the entire Deschutes River system. The steelhead are coming back now that the fish passage system is working at Pelton Round Butte. And the minimum stream, and that river, or that creek, when I started working in the Deschutes in 2000, was dry all summer in Sisters at the bridge. There was not any water in it. And if you cross over Wycus Creek now, any day in the summer, it's very close. It's more than, I think it's close to 80% of the minimum stream flows now through the piping that the Three Sisters Irrigation District has done. The stream runs all summer long through the city of Sisters as a result of these piping projects that were done because of the bringing together the irrigation district with the conservation funding. Now, I have to tell you, and you can see this is the how much water has actually been permanently protected through piping, through conservation. And it's, as of fiscal 2010, it's 84.45 CFS, which is a heck of a lot of water. I have to tell you that when I started over there in 2000, one of the longtime board members of Wycus Creek was suing the DRC and the district because of the piping project. Was absolutely adamantly opposed to it. We had real estate developers in the Swally Irrigation District who were completely opposed to the piping project because they were marketing Canal View estates. And there were people who had landscaped islands in the canals because it was their water feature. And so, it was like having riverfront, but they kind of forgot the fact that it wasn't a river, it was a canal. It was a ditch. And so they were all horrified, and there was tremendous resistance to the piping projects because everyone's water features were going to disappear. But when you started seeing the real river come back, attitudes started to change. The other approach, and this was one of the most important innovations and one of the most important parts of the solutions, was to set up the Deschutes Water Alliance Water Bank. And it was originally the DRC's water bank, and I spent a lot of years of my life figuring out how under Oregon law to make a water bank work, and then I brought in one of the best hires I ever did. I hired a real resource economist who figured out, I was fine on setting up the system, I was bad on execution and operations, so we had an economist come in on operations. But remember the map that showed how much of the irrigation district's irrigated ground was inside the city limits, inside the urban growth boundary? So finally, because this group was having this conversation, and it started out literally on the back of an envelope, I remember as I started working on this problem with all these other really smart people, I said, well, wait a second. How many acres do we have inside the UGB? And if we took all those water rights inside the UGB and we used them as they urbanized, we took that water and reallocated it in stream, wouldn't that be good for everybody potentially? Well, it took quite a while to really make it work. But what happens is you take the urbanized water rights, this is a solution. So you've got all those irrigation district lands that are going to become a part of the city. They're not going to be hayfields anymore. And they're going to be provided water by the city of Bend or the city of Redmond or whoever. And you take those urbanized water rights and you create a reserve for the districts, so that if farmers that are in the districts outside of the city need additional water, there's water available that can be shifted to them so that they can be more productive and more efficient, and they can fully meet their agricultural water needs. But what happens then is you take the balance of those water rights and you meet the municipal supply. Remember the 260,000 acre feet. So they've got targets for all of this now. And some of these water rights, agricultural rights, get allocated to municipal. Some of them go to stream flow restoration. And others are used to provide water for groundwater mitigation under the Groundwater Mitigation Program. So this bank structure now exists with the Deschutes Water Alliance. And you can see how the transfers have ramped up since 2003, when you had just a little bit of restoration and just a little bit of mitigation. The mitigation is the groundwater mitigation, where people are mitigating for the groundwater pumping. And you can see the combination of both acre feet of water on the left column for both restoration and mitigation purposes between 2003 and 2009. And the results are pretty amazing. I mean, it's 1,092 acres of water rights that have been transferred in stream, most of it mitigation, but a lot of it restoration, and additional stream flow restoration. The Reservoir Management is also underway, and they're getting integrated management of the entire reservoir system to meet the in-stream flow needs in a much more efficient way. And the leasing program has also greatly picked up over the period. I love to tell the story that when I became executive director in 2000, they'd started the leasing program in 1998, and it was completely voluntary. They didn't pay anybody anything. What they would do is, under Oregon water law, you have to use your water right at least once every 5 years or you lose it. And so some of these irrigation districts were really concerned that their patrons had not been irrigating because their patrons were doctors and dentists and lawyers from Portland who didn't want to spend their weekends moving irrigation pipe in the summer on their ranch outside Tumalo. And so one way to use the water and avoid forfeiture was to lease it in stream. So for the first 2 years, all they did was write the Tumalo Irrigation District patrons who were about to lose their water rights and say, hey, if you lease it in stream, everything will be okay. You won't forfeit your water right. And so that's down here. And then in 2001, I had the bright idea, this is my board saying, let's experiment. I said, why don't we try paying them to lease it? Because, that was a year when we had about $1 million. And the Bureau of Reclamation that year in 2001 was paying $175 an acre foot to lease water in stream in the Yakima. And the agricultural economy was fairly similar in the two basins. But I wasn't at all convinced that you'd have to pay $175 an acre foot. I mean, I used to theoretically be an economist. That's my undergraduate degree. So I wanted to test this, and I said, okay, why don't we just offer, since the only price point we have is the amount that the irrigation districts charge to deliver water to the farmer, why don't we offer to pay their assessment? And that was about $30 an acre. And so we said, we'll pay you $30 an acre if you're willing to lease your water in stream. Well, yeah, there were lots of people who wanted to do that. And then my friend, the PhD resource economist, said, well, Gail, it's kind of, that doesn't necessarily, I'm not sure that's the right price. And we need to experiment some more. And so in 2002, we did a reverse auction in the Ochoco Irrigation District. And it was amazing. We didn't even have to pay them what the assessment rate was. We had people offering to lease their water for, I think one of them was like 75 cents an acre. And so we really were learning a lot about the price points, about the value of water to different kinds of users in the basin. And we also learned that by using leasing as a tool and really funding the programs strategically in areas where the environmental restoration was really needed, we got people used to letting their water be used in stream, and that made them, and it started the conversation with the landowner, and that made them much more receptive to permanent transfers, piping solutions, and other kinds of in-stream flow restoration solutions in the future. So the end of the story is really that the problem, which is a problem throughout the western United States, of a real need to reallocate water to restore stream flows for environmental purposes, a need to reallocate water to meet needs of growing urban communities at the same time. And by a combination of citizens who are really engaged and really shared a love of a very special place, and government, providing both resources and funding, as well as some mandates in terms of the Groundwater Mitigation Program, you're really able to get broad community support for a solution that, in the context of Western water, is truly revolutionary. There is no state in the country and no area within Oregon that has more in-stream water rights than the Deschutes. There really is no comparison. There's nothing else that even begins to compare. And I can't tell you, as someone who was very involved for at least 3.5 years in this process, it's probably one of the most joyous things that I've ever done. In my role as chair of the Transportation Commission, I was over in Bend at the River House this summer in August, or anyway, it was a time when I started working over there in 2000, the river would have been not a river, it would have been a trickle outside the back of the River House where we were having our meeting. And Alan Unger, who was the mayor of Redmond, very involved in this whole process and is now one of the Deschutes County Commissioners. I was kind of standing over by the window and I was just looking at the river, and Alan said, "Gail, isn't this tremendous?" And I kind of shook my head and I thought about it and I just gave him a big hug. I mean, here is the mayor of Redmond, Oregon, who 10 years ago, through an act of faith, embraced the idea that we could take this radically different approach to solving a very difficult problem. And 10 years later, the water's there. And now the fish are coming back. And it's incredibly exciting and incredibly rewarding. And it takes people and experimentation and careful analysis, but you can come up with sustainable solutions. Do you want to do?
We have time.
We have time?
Yeah,
okay. So, questions? If you
Can you go up to the microphone?
Yeah, if people could go to the mic, I think they're recording, so.
And can you make it a question and not a comment?
Where does tree planting come into the equation?
Tree planting?
Vegetation restoration, stream bank restoration.
Yeah. Actually, when I was working on the DRC was really open to any kind of, we were looking at watershed restoration, so we were very interested in riparian restoration. And we worked on a project where we were actually, we did a forward sale of carbon credits to finance riparian restoration. And so riparian restoration is definitely a key part of the water quality improvement in the Deschutes. It's important for habitat, it's important for water quality. But frankly, in terms of the DRC as an organization, they decided they would really focus on the stream flow restoration. And it's the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council that sort of picked up the baton on the riparian restoration, working with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. So that's definitely tree planting, riparian restoration's definitely part of the equation. It's part of the overall solution and restoration of the basin. The other thing that's interesting about tree planting in the Deschutes that came up in the stream flow restoration context, and it was really, the story was first told to me by one of the elders of the Warm Springs tribe, is because of the control of fire in the Deschutes Basin, juniper has covered lots of hills that were native grasslands, and juniper uses a lot of water. And so there's quite a bit of work in the Deschutes on juniper removal, particularly in the Crooked River Basin. Juniper removal is a way to restore stream flows. So rather than tree planting, you need the planting in the riparian areas, but in the uplands for infiltration and groundwater maintenance, the juniper removal is actually an issue. Other questions? Yeah, you're an easy crowd.
While they're thinking, I have one.
Yeah.
I have one. It seems like a key component of this too was to think of the watershed as a whole system, and to get that alliance formed, to think in that way, and not to get over the individual irrigation districts, and sort of taking this broad systems view of the watershed seemed like a prerequisite for getting to the solution.
Absolutely. And what was really important about that, Bob, is if you go back to the very beginning, and the Deschutes was fortunate. You couldn't have pulled this off in a basin that didn't have the real estate development. There's a lot of money sloshing around, and there was also a lot of resource expertise. And so this particular hydrograph map was done by the water resources consultants that the tribes had brought in to do modeling for them on the hydro relicensing. And as a result of really the millions and millions of dollars that the tribes and PGE spent on studies for the hydro relicensing, an entirely new understanding of how these reservoirs all operated together and how this groundwater system operated developed, that fortunately then was able to be captured by a very smart water master in a pretty simple visual illustration. And it was this visual that communicated that systems notion to citizens that were never going to look at these very sophisticated hydrologic models that were being used in the relicensing. So you had to have the tribes and PGE investing in creating the underlying knowledge, and then you had to have the translation into a simple visualization so that the average citizen would understand that it was a system. So, other questions? Yes, ma'am. Do you want to? There's a mic here. Is that if this is easier?
Come up to one of the mics.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if this has any relevance to your work now in the Oregon Transportation Commission.
Does it have any relevance to my work on the Oregon Transportation Commission? Yes, it actually does, because, again, this gets back to what are sustainable solutions. And if you're really going to figure out how to take a complex problem, as Bob said, a systems level problem, and you're going to get people engaged and help them to see the problem in a new way so that creative and sustainable solutions can be developed, what I learned on the Deschutes was that notion of experimentation, among other things. And so if we're going to move, just to take an example, if we're going to move away from our dependence on single occupancy vehicles, and we're going to get people to use alternatives, what can we do to fund people to allow them to experiment and allow communities to experiment instead of just giving them money for roads and streets? And then how are we going to make sure that if we give them money so that they can experiment with bike shares and car shares and all these other innovative transportation demand management methods, how are we going to assure that we learn from those experiences so that we can really develop an effective program? And you think about that in terms of what happened on the Deschutes. The DRC started these real small experiments in the late 1980s and early 2000s, and then people learned, and then by 2004 the Deschutes Water Alliance was able to be built, and now they're able to deploy this full suite of mechanisms. But you have to have the experimentation, the learning, to build the momentum to try bold new things.
So might we have some results in 10 years?
Oh, I think we will. I'm absolutely confident of it. I'm already seeing it. When the city of Salem decides and the Mid-Willamette Valley folks decide that maybe they don't need a third bridge in Salem, maybe they can address the problem through transportation demand management, revolutions are happening.
We have, let me ask one question from one of our online viewers. They wanted to know if, was there any transfer of water rights in all of this?
Or
did
yes.
everyone keep their same rights? And if so, how did that transfer of rights occur?
The transfers occurred in a variety of ways, but every one of those conserved water projects, under Oregon water law, you can take the conserved water and go through a formal water rights transfer process to another use. So those conserved, the water saved through the piping would get transferred from the irrigation use to either a municipal use or an in-stream use permanently. So that was one kind of transfer. And then with some of the land that is being urbanized, those water rights are irrigation water rights, and those through the Deschutes Water Bank are now being transferred through the water rights system permanently in stream or to municipal uses. So all of this is done through the formal water rights transfer process.
Hi, I'm Mary Vogel. I had once lived in both Sisters and in Bend, but haven't been back for ages, so this is really exciting to hear about. I can't wait now to get back over there. I've been watching my carbon footprint very carefully, and now that I live here. But anyway, I was wondering what role the media might have played in all this. Were they helpful at all? Were you mainly under the radar, or what role did they play?
The media was actually terrific, but again, it gets back to this picture, and Western water law is really it's great for people like me who like kind of arcane puzzles. But it's not real sensible to most people, and they don't. And so it was really important to be able to tell this story in a way that people could understand, so that they could kind of overcome the Canal View Estates mentality and realize that maybe the water would be better if it were in the river. And so the Bend Bulletin was terrific in running great stories on the piping projects, great stories on the groundwater mitigation program. We had a wonderful award-winning reporter at that time, Rachel Odell, who's gone on to bigger and better things, who was covering this story for the Bulletin. The Source was which is like the Central Oregon version of Willamette Week. They were terrific as well, and both the Source and the Bend Bulletin in the River Renaissance, or whatever they call the River celebration that is done annually in Deschutes by the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, they ran the whale diagram for more than 1 year as a spread centerfold voluntarily, and we had great cooperation from them. And there's also, this is kind of early in terms of what we now think of as the online media, but there's an online. Even in that period, there were a lot of people that were getting their news more from a very good online news service, the name of which I'm forgetting, but it's really basically was one guy, and he did really in-depth coverage on his online paper as well. So media was tremendously important in telling the story, helping people understand that the fish really were going to come back, that we needed to put water back in the river, that you could put water back in the river without. And actually, the Capital Press, which is the agricultural weekly that is a regional paper, they also gave very favorable coverage to the restoration effort because it was done in very close cooperation with the irrigation districts and the agricultural landowners. Yes, sir.
Yeah. My question is about the sort of legislative side of these initiatives. My understanding was that there were some changes that had to be made to the water laws and to the water rights to transfers and so forth to get some of these, to get the water bank set up and some of these other redistribution initiatives. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and whether that was coordinated in any way.
It was very coordinated. The entire thing could be done under existing water law, pre-2000 water law, with no new law. It was all possible to do under the water law in 2000. There ended up being legislation because the groundwater mitigation rule was appealed by Water Rights of Oregon because they didn't think the bucket for bucket was quite bucket for bucket enough. And it's a very long and complicated story having to do with the timing of when the water came out of the ground versus when the water was being put back into the river. And the Oregon Court of Appeals, right after that, I'm going to get the years wrong, but the Court of Appeals overturned the groundwater mitigation rule that had been adopted, and the legislature and the community in Central Oregon didn't want to wait around to go to the Supreme Court, didn't want to continue to speculate. They wanted to basically proceed with the program that had been developed under the administrative rules. And so they passed legislation to statutorily authorize the Groundwater Mitigation Bank in order to avoid having to wait out the litigation process to get the final answer. So that's the reason the legislation was adopted, was mainly to overcome it. This is my version of events. Somebody else might tell you the story a little bit differently, but that's my version of why the legislation was passed. And there have been a number of administrative reforms. When we first started doing the in-stream leases and the conserved water right transfers in-stream, it was an extremely painful administrative process. And we were all kind of tearing our hair out trying to, and if you'd ever see Bruce Aylward, my friend, the resource economist, he doesn't have much hair to pull out. It was very cumbersome to get to process the transfers, which is a constant bane of Western water law. But the Oregon Water Resources Department was really great about it. And once we figured out how to provide the appropriate safeguards for the public interest and for the existing water users, a whole series of administrative reforms were done, most of them without any rule change, so that we were able to process the transfers under the existing rules without them taking an interminable amount of time. So it didn't take as much. It's been a real lesson for me. There are a lot of people, including Charles Wilkinson, who has for a number of years called for let's get rid of the prior appropriation doctrine. And I guess the lesson for me in this is that you can restore stream flows without attacking the entire prior appropriation system. You can figure out a way to solve the problem within the system.
Yeah, we had another question from one of our online viewers about what effect did all of this have on the rates of urbanization in the area? Did this sort of facilitate?
Actually, I don't think it had much of any effect on the rate of urbanization because it was a red-hot real estate market anyway, and the decisions on urbanization in Oregon and the decisions on urbanization in this area are made under our land use laws. So the water supply question sort of peripherally got addressed in terms of the urban growth boundary changes, but most of this all happened. Bend is seeking an urban growth boundary expansion right now, but at the time that all this was happening, there weren't any modifications. There really weren't any pending modifications of the urban growth boundaries, and so it was reallocating the water from agriculture to urban simultaneously with the in-stream flow restoration, but I don't think it was accelerating the urbanization rate. It was all just being done consistent with the land use plans. But I don't have any data to back that up. And it certainly doesn't even, it pales in comparison to what the real estate market downturn did.
Right. So. Okay, maybe one last question.
I was just wondering if there's any other of these water banks going on in Oregon?
Water banks?
Yeah. Any other instances?
Yes, in the Klamath, sort of. But it's not. It doesn't really work the same, and it's not nearly as robust. There are conversations underway in the Rogue Basin, and there are conversations underway in the Walla Walla Basin. But there aren't any other banks like this. And one of the things for this to really work, the DRC got invited by and had conversations with Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs about could we use these tools in the John Day. And you've got to have a certain population level and a certain kind of real estate transaction level for it to really hum. And so in a basin like the John Day, it's hard to get enough kind of action to get something as sophisticated as the bank. Because the reason that the bank itself works as well as it works is because you're urbanizing onto agricultural lands. So that's happening in the Rogue. It's happening in the Klamath. It's really not happening in the John Day. And frankly, it's not happening in the Walla Walla either. So you have to have that right dynamic to really have a robust bank. The other place in the western United States where there's a really robust multi-purpose bank, but it's not for stream flow restoration, but it does allow reallocation between agriculture and municipal, is the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, which is outside of Boulder. It's in that area, sort of all around Boulder, and it's a very robust market where the trades go on between municipal and agricultural on a regular basis. And it has some sophistication that, frankly, the Deschutes market doesn't have yet, just because the way their water shares work, which is different than the way the water rights work in the Deschutes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Gail.